Okay, this is chapter 1 of our Designing User Experience book. It's serving mostly as an introduction. You can see it right there in the title. This is an introduction to user experience design. What we're going to cover mostly in this chapter is the fundamentals of trying to identify what is design and what is user experience design and what does it mean and who are the people that are doing this on a project and what skills do they need to have. And so it's designed to serve mostly as an overview. We'll go into most of these concepts in greater detail later on, but for now we'll get a decent overview by looking through some of this material. Let's start by just asking maybe the most fundamental question here. What is design? What does it even mean? Design can refer to a process, you see here, or the result of a process. So you could refer to something as being a design activity, meaning things that you do, or refer to someone's design being then the result. We're going to use those interchangeably. You'll see the terminology used in multiple different ways. But I like the definition and kind of the quote that they give here in chapter 1. It talks about standing with a foot in two worlds, the world of technology and the world of people. And you'll see that a lot. We talked about that a lot in 394, how you're always kind of going back and forth between the users and the system and making sure to account for both sides. Same thing when we talk about design here. There's a human side of things and there's a technology side of things, and the marriage between those two becomes user experience design. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Big bullet point down there at the bottom talking about design is rarely straightforward. We're going to spend some time talking about the process of design. We have many chapters where we'll go over different process steps, but you have to realize that this is not a strict step-by-step, do one step and then move on type of activity. It's rarely straightforward. You do some things, then you go back and repeat other activities, you make changes, you make adjustments and move along. So there's a lot of art to design, as you can imagine, and some of that art comes into play in the fact that it's not a very mechanistic approach, that kind of sense. A little bit further on defining what design is. Design can refer to a lot of different things, but I think it's best to almost think of it like a continuum. So if I draw here a little continuum, pardon my straight line there, you see on one end we might refer to engineering design. Engineering design is focused mostly on function. Can something function properly? It talks about, a bridge or a building, something along those lines. We've got to make sure that all our angles are right angles, and we've got to put rivets here, and we've got to make sure that this is supported by this lever, and we've got to make sure that all of our formulas, hold the weight that they need to, those kind of things. It's engineering design. The other end of the spectrum would be artistic design. An artistic design is focused on form. Okay, or you can think, or fashion might be a different term. Okay, artistic design is about innovation. It's about creativity. It's about a lot of the more abstract aspects of design. The design that we're talking about in this class, and I would almost say most design, even if you're talking about buildings and things, falls somewhere between these two, between form and function. And so if we were to draw something in the middle, this would be, they call it design as craft. Or you can just put a note here. UX would fall right in between those two. There's aspects of function that we need to strongly consider. The system has to do everything that we want it to be able to do. But we're also considering the form or the artistic angle to things. It needs to look nice. It needs to behave in a manner that is innovative and interesting, but also enjoyable. And so that involves a lot of creativity, involves a little bit of art in things. And so the note here is that we're trying to find the proper balance between form and function. How we go about doing that is going to be the tricky challenge that we're going to talk through. Okay. So what is UX? Well, user experience design encompasses a lot of different things. Okay, you talk about product design is where we might talk about, let's say we were designing a new smartphone. Okay, if we were designing a new smartphone, we would consider both the hardware and the software side of things. So we want the phone's hardware pieces to work properly. We want to have a good power button. We want to make sure that people can control the volume properly. We want to have good inputs so that if you're connecting different devices to it, that'd be the hardware side of things. But then the software to support that hardware needs to be able to run properly. That would be product design. System design is concerned only with the software piece to it. So this would be if we were, designing just an app that might run on smartphones. That would be an example of system design. Service design is kind of a corollary to system design, but service design is looking at software again, but it's software that might run across different platforms or different devices. And so you could think of this as an app that also exists as, a website, if you can access it in many different ways. Think like Facebook. Okay, Facebook can be accessed via website, via mobile app, via iPad app. They even may have desktop applications that I'm not even aware of. A lot of different pieces to it. And so that would be a service design. We're going to sit mostly here, focusing on one specific system, but we're going to lean a little bit in this direction here too, talking about service design. One of the things that we'll spend some time talking about when we get into the design fundamentals piece later on is how you have a website that needs to morph and change depending upon the size of the screen. So if we have a website that is viewed on a big desktop monitor, it's going to look one way versus a small mobile phone is going to look a very different way. And that would be kind of service design. It's running on multiple different platforms, and there's unique considerations to each platform that we need to keep in mind. We also, when we think about service design, you're also thinking about an app and how it might interact with other applications in that kind of sense. So it's a lot of unique context to it, but user experience design is not only focused on one specific piece of software. It's an important note to make there. Our context for design is mostly going to be systems, and we refer to them as interactive systems. So the book really makes a habit of pointing specifically to that term, interactive systems, because that's our goal, is to define the interaction between the user and the system in that kind of way. There's a lot of different ways that you can interact with the system. In 394, we focused pretty much exclusively on video. And we will spend most of our time talking about video-based interface, graphical user interface. But we're going to dabble just a little bit into some of these other forms, specifically audio there. Our last chapter, we're going to talk about mixed mode design and how you can incorporate different modes of communication into your design. I think it'll be really interesting. I'd love to get in the process of figuring out the best way to design like an Alexa app or something like that. I think that'd be really fun sometime, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, but the key note here is interactive systems where the user is interacting with it in a variety of different ways. And our job as designers is to try to make that interaction as pleasing, as helpful as possible. Okay. All right, moving on. The scope of user experience design. A lot of different types of systems, a lot of different types of services. This is the key word here for this particular slide. We talk about the idea of service design, recognizing that things work in a variety of different forms. So you see this term, you might see environments. It'll use the term ecology a little bit later to talk about crossing multiple different platforms and things. But there's a lot of different ways in which systems interact, and a lot of different ways that users interact with not only one particular system, but then a variety of different ones. Let me mention, I brought up the idea of ecologies. Let's get to that a little more specifically. The idea of a device ecology is that you've got a system that interacts with a variety of different other systems. You've got a system that is accessible on a number of different hardware pieces. So the example that the book gives talks about using the AirDrop feature on a phone. When using the AirDrop feature, that's not just one phone's interaction, that's two phones interacting with each other. And so designing that type of feature or designing that part of the system means you're designing not only what it looks like on the phone that is sending the information, but also what it looks like on the phone that is receiving the information. And so you got to think about both sides of this ecology, as they call it, because that's the way the world is increasingly working. We don't just sit down with our computers and interact with them solely on their own. I mean, right now I've got my iPad going with my pen. I've also got my laptop running so that I can record various different things. I've got my phone here in case something goes on. Like, there's all kinds of different devices and things, and these are all interacting with each other. And that device ecology becomes enormously important. We have to understand that, and we have to factor that into our design. And so it's increasingly important that we think through not just the one device that someone's using a system on, but also all of the other devices that are influenced by that one particular system. You see an example here that it talks about the PlayStation Vita. A little bit of an outdated term, but some of the examples here have to find their way into textbooks and things. But the idea is you got a handheld device that's interacting with a game console, and their interaction back and forth makes up a device ecology in that kind of way. Or to use another example, they mentioned the company Burberry, and how they use a variety of different systems. You see that they've got RFID tags into all of their clothes. They've got interactive mirrors that become screens so people can interact with a variety of different things. They've got digital displays all going throughout their store. All kinds of different things going on at the same time, and they all need the ability to interact with each other. They're all using similar information. People are moving from one device to another device all throughout the store. And so, like I said, the major point here is just recognizing the simplest form of designing a system is designing one system that runs on one device. But that's just not how systems work anymore. A system is running on one device, interacting with other systems. That same system might be running on multiple devices that all need to interact with each other. It becomes increasingly complex to design what that system looks like and how it functions and things like that. So we've got to factor all of that in when we go through design. It's a very important part of the process. A couple other notes, then we'll wrap things up. When we talk about user experience design, we're not just designing the interface to the system. This is one of the major differences between how we talked about UI design in 394 and how we'll talk about it here. In 394, our focus was very narrow. We need a screen. Okay, what does that screen need to look like? Where do we organize all of the different buttons? And then you kind of move on to the next screen. With experience design, we're looking a lot more holistic at how does the user interact with the system as a whole? How do you move from one screen to the next? How do we make those transitions work very smoothly? How do we organize all of the content so that it's a nice cohesive unit? And when I move from this system potentially into other systems and come back, is that process smooth and does it interact really well? And so user experience design is more than just taking one screen and trying to figure out, okay, what does this screen need to look like? It's all about the entire process, start to finish. It's going to involve a lot more, that we're going to bring in a lot more content. It's basically why this is an entire quarter's worth of stuff instead of just 2 or 3 class periods. But I think you'll get a kick out of it once we get into all the different details and things. A couple final notes. Big note here talking about how people and systems are different, and when you're designing a system that's going to influence both technology and people, one of those is going to receive priority. And so there's 2 different approaches that we can take to designing systems. One would be a machine-centered design or machine-oriented design. And that type of approach says, how can I maximize what this system can do? How do I give it the coolest capabilities? How do I max out what it can accomplish? How do I add as many different features and functions as I possibly can? That's the approach of machine-centered design. Human-centered design emphasizes the humans or the users that are using the system and says not how can I make this system run as best as possible, but how can I make this system work as well as it needs to for the people that are actually going to be using it. And this becomes, I think, one of the most important jobs of a systems analyst on a project. There are developers who oftentimes their mentality tends to be a little bit more in that machine-centered design, which you can understand. Their world is, how do I get this computer to do what I need it to do? Your job as an analyst is to advocate for users, is to make sure that they stay at the center of everything that's done on a project. And so one of the things that you'll notice throughout this textbook, no matter what we're talking about, it's going to be human-centered, because that needs to be the focus. We're not just designing systems to maximize their capabilities. We're designing systems that certain users need to be able to use. And so we need to understand not only the technology that we're using, but also understand the people that are going to be using the system. And so when we talk about like what skills does a designer need to have, it's not just technology skills, it's also the human side of things as well. Let me show you kind of this. I'll skip to the picture here so you can see we've got the technology piece. So you need to understand, how do systems operate and what can they do and what are the various different capabilities and how does all the architecture work behind the scenes. You need to understand all of that. It's very important. But the human side of things is also incredibly important too. How do people work? How do people work well? We're going to talk in this class about some human psychology things. We're going to understand, how do people remember information? How do they share information? How do they collaborate with other people? And that's an important aspect of designing a system, because we need to understand the people that are actually using it. And so we're going to talk about the technology piece. We're going to talk about the people piece. We're going to spend some time focused on just general design. So I'm going to underline that here. What is good design? And what does that look like? Not just design of systems, but in general. Like, what is it that makes for good design? And then specifically, how do we design good systems? What are principles that we can follow? And then as far as the bottom aspect goes, activities and context, this is recognizing that if you want to design a good system, you need to understand what that system is being used for. And so if we're designing a system that's going to be used by a retail company, we need to understand retail. How does it work? What do people do? Things along those lines. That becomes very valuable. And your job oftentimes as an analyst is to not only understand the people using the system, but also the activities, the things that they're actually doing. What are their tasks? That'll help you understand why it becomes necessary to design the system in the way it's designed. Now, that's a lot. There's a lot that goes into that. And so it's why we try to organize the course as best we possibly can. I've broken down this class into 3 primary tracks. There's one track that we'll call the design process. This is where we're going to start. Design process is focused on how do we actually go about designing a system? What are the steps that are involved? And so we'll walk through, they use terms like envisionment, and you'll see evaluation and things along those lines. But what are the step-by-step approach that we would take? We're also going to talk about design principles. This would be, if I can go back a slide, this would be the kind of the right-hand side. What is good design versus bad design? Okay, it's an important aspect, and it's an important thing to learn, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking through what are the principles of good design. And then while we're doing that, we're going to learn what we call design technique. This is where we're going to learn some tools for going about doing design. Specifically, we're going to focus on Adobe UX. Or excuse me, I always refer to it as UX, Adobe XD. It's the way that they refer to their particular tool. There's a lot that's going to go into this class. There's a lot of material that we're going to cover. We're going to cover a lot in a short amount of time. That's just the nature of how this quarter is going to go. But I encourage you to be along for the ride. I encourage you to stay with the material. I think you're going to find it really interesting along the way. So that's chapter 1. In a nutshell, if I could summarize things, design is all about finding that proper balance between form and function. Okay, we want the system to do what it is supposed to do, but we want it to be done in an artistic, creative way that works for the users. We want to be human-centered in our approach to everything that we do. And then the last big bullet point from this chapter is recognizing that designing a system is not just taking one screen and maximizing what can be done on that screen. It's recognizing that a user using a system is also interacting with other systems, also interacting with other devices, Systems are used across multiple different platforms, and so we have to understand and appreciate the complexity of designing systems. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it along the way.